Let us pray. And now, God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Shug Jordan, the coach of Auburn University, needed some help doing some recruiting. So he called upon one of his former players, Mike Collins, who then was playing for the Miami Dolphins, and asked him to provide some help in recruiting. And Mike said, okay, and the two of them met, and Mike said, okay, coach, what kind of player are you looking for? And the coach said, well, you know that fella who hits somebody and knocks the guy down and the guy stays down? Mike says, we don't want that guy that got knocked down, do we, coach? No, of course we don't. And you know that guy that gets knocked down by that player, and he gets knocked down, he gets back up, and then he gets knocked down again and he stays down? Well, we don't want someone like him, do we, coach? No, you're right, we don't. Now, you know that fellow who gets knocked down and he gets up, and he gets knocked down, and he gets up, and he gets knocked down, and he gets up, and he keeps on getting up? Mike says, that's the player that we want, right, coach? And coach said, no, we want you to go find the guy that was knocking all them fellas down. That's the guy we want for our team. That's the kind of guy we want in our lives. To be seen with on the field of life, if you will. To be seen with at the dinners. To be seen with at the banquets, in public, even in church. We don't want to be seen with the guy that keeps getting knocked down over and over again. We don't want to be seen with the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. But those are the people that Jesus encourages us to associate with. In the passage for today, the Pharisees are keeping an eye on Jesus and they're grumbling. There's nothing new about that, but in this case, they're not just grumbling about him, they're grumbling about the kind of people that are associating with him. Jesus had spent so much time with the uneducated, those who had little use for the trappings of religion, for the people that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the rest considered to be secular and scum. Fishermen and tax collectors, prostitutes, and those who were crippled and lame and blind. The kind of people that the Pharisees and the Sadducees held in contempt. And Jesus taught that those were the folks that we should associate with. In fact, on one occasion, he said to the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the rest that all of those kind of people, the crippled, the poor, the lame, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, all of those that were considered to be the scum of the earth, he said they get to be in the kingdom of heaven before the religious folks did. And for them, it seemed rather weird and peculiar and strange that Jesus would say such a thing. But for Jesus, it was the heart of his message, the core of his gospel. In the passage today, Jesus says, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back and you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor. When you give a banquet, invite the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed. For though they can't repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, when we think about what Jesus is saying and we compare that to the way marketers tell us to advance the cause of the church, it seems to be directly the opposite. You know how marketing approaches just about everything. You have to get a target audience, the person that you're trying to connect to. And what they tell us when you go to these seminars as pastors and leaders is that you target the well-educated, the deployed, the contemporary, those who are open to learning new things, those who have a strong family and a healthy lifestyle, those who have a large income, those who are considered successful. You target them and connect with them and minister to them, and you can bring them into your church. You don't ever go to any of those church growth seminars where they tell you, now you find the person who is the poorest. You find the guy who is crippled and lame and blind. You find the guy that has the least to offer, and you go after that person. But that's who Jesus said to go after. He didn't just say it here, he said it over and over again. In another place in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, I have come to seek and to save those who are lost. He says, those that are well don't need a physician, but those who are sick, I've come to take care of the sick. When Jesus began his ministry, he said that God had anointed him to preach good news to the poor and proclaim release to those who were captives and recovery of sight to those who were blind, and to set at liberty those who were oppressed. Jesus' emphasis was on the poor, the blind, the oppressed, the captives. Is that the kind of people we target in our church, or that most churches seem to target? Oh, I understand we support missions, and well, we should. We provide baskets of food and supplies for school and send it to the Baptist Center. We collect offerings that go to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship's ministry around the world, and we should. I encourage us to continue and to advance and to increase our giving in all of these areas. The question is, what about hands-on mission? What about us becoming missional people? What about us seeing ourselves not as supporting a Baptist mission center downtown, but as being a mission center right here, as being missional people in the location where God has planted us? Reggie McNeil, one of the more powerful commentators on the contemporary church, writes in his popular book, The Present Future, church culture in North America is a mere vestige of the original Christian movement, an institutional expression of religion that is part civil religion and part club, where religious people can hang out with those whose politics, worldview, and lifestyle match theirs. In other words, we want to be around people who are like us. Now, this is natural. This is understandable. This is even human nature. The problem is that it's not Christian. Jesus said, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, don't invite your brothers and sisters, don't invite your relatives or your rich neighbors. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you will be blessed. Now, we've talked a lot about Patterson Avenue Baptist Church becoming a missional congregation, becoming a missional church. What does this passage say for us as we transition towards this kind of missional expression of church? First of all, it says that we reject ownership of the church. The church doesn't belong to you or to me. It doesn't belong even to the trustees, except maybe in the legal sense of the word here in our nation. The church belongs to God. When I was in Louisville, Kentucky and seminary, I had an opportunity to work with the church. I've told you, they had hired me to come as a youth minister. So I came. They were centered in the inner city, and all of the youth that were in that community were on the streets at all hours, many of them involved in gangs and violence and other kinds of things. And it was, I thought, the job of myself as youth minister to connect with the youth in the community of that church. So I got together several of my friends from seminary, and we had an all-night lock-in at the church. And we had kids from all over the community came, and we played basketball, we watched movies, we had devotions, we ate pizza in the middle of the night and donuts way too early in the morning. It was a long night, but it was a wonderful night. And one of the little young men that I had a chance to talk to, named Timmy, in that evening, had the chance to hear the gospel of God's love and grace, and he responded to it with the commitment of his life and faith. After the morning had ended and the long night was over, I went home and was taking a nap for the afternoon, and I got a call from one of the trustees of the church. You need to come down here right away. So I went down to the church, and in the bathroom there had been some minor vandalism had taken place. I said, I was sorry that happened. We didn't notice it. I would pay for it out of my own pocket. And he says, you don't understand. We don't want those kids here. And I said, let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you about the evening. Let me tell you about little Timmy who gave his life to Jesus. And he says, you don't understand. We don't want kids like that in our church. They thought it was their church, for their people, for their community, the ones that were like them. They didn't want to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. There's also a message here that says we reject the idea that we are privileged people who get to have superior priority when it comes to the ministry of the church. I asked one time the question, rhetorical, but it was answered. I asked the question in one setting, who gets the priority? Who is the primary person that we minister to? Is it those that are in the fellowship, or are we trying to connect to and minister to those outside of the church? And one person in the room said that it is to care for the members because membership has its privileges. We exist for the members? Hardly seems to be the spirit and teaching of Jesus. Hardly seems to be the witness we see in the early church. We do care for the members of the church, obviously. But we exist as a community of faith, as a missional people, to care primarily for those who are not here, who are not connected, who may be poor, crippled, lamed, and hurting in so many different ways. Even if they're not lame, poor, and crippled, there's a lot of hurt that hinders us and tears us down. We exist to be missional people connecting to them. There's also a distinct lesson here about the rejection of casting blame. You saw what the Pharisees did. They began, it said in verse 1, having this party, inviting Jesus, and what were they doing? The text says they were keeping an eye on him. Because they knew he was going to do something they didn't think was right. He was going to heal somebody, and it was the Sabbath. He was going to care for somebody that was poor. He was going to touch somebody who was unclean. He had a habit of doing that. So they invite him to his house, and they have this party, but the text says they were keeping an eye on him. There was a survey by Barna Group that asked unchurched people what their perceptions of the church in general were. And they said that they would be afraid to go to most churches to ask for help if they were in need, because they were afraid that rather than being helped, they would be judged. In other words, those folks looked at church the way we do the Pharisees. Jesus' lesson also affirms that there should be a faith in God as the provider. Now, we understand that there's a mindset among us. I feel it as well when I lay my head on my pillow at night and worry and wonder what's next for us as a congregation. And the mindset is this: if we don't get some more people in here that bring a checkbook and are willing to write a check, if we don't do that, then somehow we are not going to be able to pay the bills. And you know what? That's a rational and reasonable thing to consider. And yet Jesus says, you reach the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, the people who will come who don't have a paycheck or a checkbook or an investment account or a savings account. They maybe have a few dollars that they keep in the mattress, but that's about it. And that's who you connect to. That's who you reach. I was reminded as I thought about this of the Valley City United Church of Christ, a little congregation in the middle of nowhere who invited me to come out for 3 years to be their interim pastor. They never intended to find somebody after I got there, I thought. I was their interim pastor. That's the guy who fills in for 3 years. And while I was there as interim pastor, I met the most interesting character who was a part of that fellowship. His name was Bill Bickle. Bill was extremely poor, only had a few sets of clothes. He was extremely poor. He lived in an old chicken coop that had been converted into a place where he had a little cot and a place to sleep for the night. He was mentally ill, had lost his mind, so to speak, when he had been a veteran in war. He'd never received much of an education. He had no family to take care of him. It just reminded me that all that stuff we talk about, homelessness in the big city, affects all of the rural communities as well. Well, every Sunday, Bill would walk to church. Half the time he was drunk. All the time he smelled like he was drunk. All of the dogs in the neighborhood would follow Bill and come to church. But the people in that church were kind to him. They fed him and clothed him. After church, invariably someone would invite him by the house so that he could bathe. They would help him in any way they could. I visited that old chicken coop one day, and I said to Bill, "Bill, you've been coming to church for a long time. Can you tell me why?" He said, "Jesus is there, and Jesus loved me when nobody would." Now, who was it that was loving him that he saw as Jesus? This was people who bought him lunch, who gave him a bath, who gave him a new set of clothing. I asked at a session meeting at the church, "Why are you folks so generous to Bill?" And one of them spoke up and said, "Bill Bickle is a test of our faith. If we don't love him and take care of him, can we really say that we love and worship Jesus?" Bill Bickle had nothing of value to offer. There was no money he could bring. There was no gifts of leadership and ministry that he could share. But Valley City Church took care of him. It was part of their ministry to Jesus. It was an expression of their faith in God as the one who would provide. So they were going to care for the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, as Jesus had said. When you give a banquet, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, your rich neighbor. When you give a banquet, you invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. When you take care of the least of these, you will be blessed. You've heard me tell stories of the great preacher Fred Craddock. I enjoy his preaching and teaching, and this is one of my favorite stories of his. Fred was invited to preach for an extended weekend in Winnipeg, Canada, traveling from Atlanta in October. It was going to be a Friday night, a Saturday morning, Saturday evening, Sunday morning, Sunday night kind of thing. And so after the Friday night service had finished and they were taking Fred back to the hotel, Fred noticed that even though it was early part of October, the sky was spitting snow. And so Fred asked his host about it, and they said, "Oh, don't worry about it. There's not going to be much to it." Fred said, "That's fine, because I'm from Atlanta, and all I brought was a thin coat. I'm not sure I could take much more." The next morning, well, you can guess what happened. Fred couldn't even open his door in the morning to get out because there was so much snow, and it was so terribly cold. The host called and apologized. "We're going to have to cancel this morning, maybe this evening as well. Nobody expected the storm to be this bad. Nobody expected it. The plows aren't ready. The workers aren't ready. My drive is covered. I can't even come and bring you some food." But about 1 block from you, there's a little diner. And if there's any place in town that's going to be open on a day like this, it'll be that diner. If you can get there, I'm sure you can get some breakfast. So Fred cursed his luck and put on his little thin coat, the only one he'd brought, as he prepared for weather similar to that of Atlanta, Georgia. And he pushed himself out of the room and walked down the block to that little diner. Sure enough, it was opened. It was crowded. Every seat was taken. But one of the men scooted over and provided a little bit more room at one of the tables. Fred squeezed in, and the waiter came up to him. He describes the waiter as a man who was wearing more food on his apron than there probably was in the kitchen. And he said, "Can I see a menu?" And the waiter said, "No reason to ask for a menu. We didn't get any deliveries today because of the snow. All we've got is soup." "Well, soup it is," Fred said. And he brought it to him in a tall mug. It was gray. It looked nasty. Fred, in his mind, said, "Could this be cream of mouse?" But it was warm, so he wrapped his fingers around it and sat there for a few moments. Suddenly, the door opened. The winds began to howl. The cold surges into the room. "Shut the blankety-blank door," someone said. A woman about 40 came in. She was thin and cold. There was icicles forming on her hair. Men at one of the tables slid over a little bit so that she could have room as well. "What you want?" the cook said. "Can I just get a glass of water?" "Look, lady, it's crowded in here. We don't have no glass of water. If you want, you have to order something or you have to leave." Apparently, she wasn't able to buy anything. So she stood up to leave. And as she did, her table stood up and began to leave. Then others throughout the restaurant began to leave. Then Fred himself got up to leave. All right, she can say," the soup master said. He brought her a bowl of soup. Fred turned to the guy who was sitting next to him. "Who is she? She must be somebody important." The guy said, "I've never seen her before in my life. But I kind of figure if she's not welcome here, ain't nobody welcome here." Fred smiled and grabbed his bowl of soup. It wasn't bad, really. It was rather tasty. Later on, he couldn't manage to figure out the taste, but finally it dawned on him. He had tasted it before. This cream of mouse soup tasted for all the world like bread and wine. It tasted like bread and wine. Amen.